Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Documenting COVID-19, a discussion on cultural documentation during the COVID-19 pandemic. As Nikki said, I'm Doug Peach, Folklife Specialist at the American Folklife Center and Project Manager for the COVID-19 American History Project. You know, as we've been traveling throughout the United States and we've been collecting interviews for this project, we've noticed something slightly interesting. Um, every American experienced COVID-19. We know this, whether someone contracted the virus or school shut down or we went into telework, we know that everyone experienced this. But what's also less talked about is that every person's experience of the pandemic was unique and different. And you know, we know about the important role of medical workers, and we were keeping our eye on public health information during the pandemic. But much of the variety of COVID-19 experiences was overlooked, underreported on, or often just wasn't talked about. And so for these reasons, the role of community-based documentarians is extremely important, as they were the ones working in various communities, understanding how the pandemic was happening specifically within different regions, communities, localities, what have you. So, you know, for me, the work that the folks who are doing on the stage here is absolutely paramount, because without this information about the COVID-19 pandemic, how can we understand, how can we process, how can we come to terms with what's happened over the past 5 years? So today we've gathered these wonderful people on stage to talk about what it means to do cultural documentation during this tumultuous time in American history. Let me mention them briefly, and then we're going to move into some introductions that they're going to do on their own. To my left is Midge Dellinger, an oral historian in the Historic and Cultural Preservation Department for the Muskogee Creek Nation. Dr. Allie Martin, assistant professor at Dartmouth College. Nicole Musgrave, a folklorist, writer, and director of Living Traditions, and then Camilo Jose Vergara, who's a photographer, a sociologist, and a urban archivist. So we're gonna have each of the panelists introduce themselves, talk about the work that they've done during COVID-19. Then we're also going to move into some discussion and some questions, and then we'll end today with a question and answer session. So please get your questions ready for those on the stage. Before we begin, I want to share that we're going to be talking about COVID-19 primarily in the past tense today. You know, compared to the summer of 2020, COVID is a very different reality for much of American society. For many people, COVID is not at the foreground of their thinking and their experiences on a day-to-day basis. But we also want to recognize that for some, COVID still is very much a part of their everyday experience. And I'm particularly thinking about those with long COVID here. So while we're going to be talking about COVID in the past tense primarily today, we want to acknowledge that for many, COVID is very much still in their present. And so with that, let's go ahead and get going. And we're going to ask the panelists to introduce themselves and to talk about the work that they've done during the COVID-19 pandemic. Let's begin with you, Midge. Would you like to tell us about you and the pandemic documentation that you've done?
Sure. Can everyone hear me? Okay, well, His Jay, hello. It is fantastic to be here today at the Library of Congress. This is my first visit to the library, and so Mado, thank you, Dr. Peach, for the invitation. As a quick introduction to the Muskogee Creek Nation, Muskogee Reservation lands are in northeast Oklahoma, and as a thriving and sovereign nation, the Muskogee Creek Nation is the fourth largest tribal nation in the United States. During the years 2021 and 2022, I engaged Muskogee citizens and community members in an oral history project titled A 21st Century Pandemic in Indian Country, The Resilience of the Muskogee Creek Nation Against COVID-19. All of us in this room have memories and stories about the COVID-19 pandemic. The world experienced mass illness, death, and chaos. But what do people really remember about the COVID-19 pandemic? What lingers or remains about such a catastrophic time in both historical narrative and public memory? Next slide. Throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, described by Muskogee people as Inokida Yikchi, which translates to strong illness, It was painfully clear to the people and tribal nations of Indian country the devastation that COVID-19 was having on their lives. Long-standing challenges of colonialism were exacerbated by an invisible killer, creating disproportionate adverse impacts on Indigenous peoples. For example, Native American and Alaska Native peoples experienced the incidence of COVID-19 and a mortality rate 3.5 times higher than the country's white population. Yet, the story of the pandemic in Indian country remains lost to public memory. During the early, next slide. During the early years of the pandemic, non-Indigenous media sources provided the public with an abundance of information about the global pandemic, but offered little to no reporting about what the impact of COVID-19 was doing to Indigenous peoples. It was this erasure of Indigenous lives that sparked the need for my oral history project. The pandemic story of Indian country, how Indigenous peoples suffered the pandemic, but also how they maneuvered and survived COVID-19 is just as significant to any other story to an inclusive and truthful narrative and memory of the pandemic. Next slide, please. I invite all of you to listen to Muskogee people sharing their pandemic stories. These oral testimonies can be found at the Muskogee Creek Nation National Library and Archives Digital Archive, and I have the web address here. I also want to mention a recently released book, COVID-19 in Indian Country, Native American Memories and Experiences of the Pandemic. I had the opportunity, along with my boss, Ms. Raylyn Butler, who is our Secretary of Culture and Humanities at the Muskogee Creek Nation, to contribute a chapter to this book. In this book are stories of how Indigenous peoples met great survival challenges through acts of Indigenous innovation and resilience to the COVID-19 pandemic. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Midge. Allie, would you like to go next?
Sure. Can you all hear me? Cool. So I'm Allie Martin. I'll introduce myself. I guess I'll introduce this book that just came out today. And thank you. Thank you. And I'll introduce my lab, and then we'll get to the project. So I am by training an ethnomusicologist, which means that I study music and culture. Specifically, I am interested in the musical and sonic decisions that people make every day. That's my go-to descriptor. And as an ethnomusicologist, most of my work has been about listening to gentrification in Washington, D.C. I'm from PG County, so it's very nice to be home. And so this is the work that has gone into a book like this. But at Dartmouth College, where I work, in 2021, I started a lab called the Black Sound Lab. And this lab is dedicated to amplifying Black life and decriminalizing Black sound, largely through digital practice. Now, at the time, it was digital practice, but we've since expanded into more in-person and site-specific work. And our first major project in this lab was called Black COVID Care. And so when we started this lab, I really wanted to sort of jump on the train of working with COVID data. A lot of the digital humanists and the data scientists and the folks that I was working with were working with COVID data, and I was like, I want to sonify this data. So when I say sonify, I mean represent in some way through sound rather than visually in a chart or a graph or something like that. But when it came to thinking about what to sonify, it seemed that we could make sonifications that lent towards catastrophe. We could think about increased death rates, increased infection rates. We could think about vaccine limitations, vaccine hesitancy. And I found myself being really hesitant about sonifying Black people's increased proximity to death. And rather than do that, we decided to sonify stories of care, stories of how Black people were taking care of each other during the pandemic and beyond the pandemic as well. So we started to gather all these stories from around the country, and then we put them into a project called Black COVID Care, which is based in a galaxy. And when you go to, if you go to blackcovidcare.com, you can click on stars in the galaxy and read stories of people taking care of themselves. This can be art exhibitions, this could be virtual dance parties, this could be Black churches acting as vaccination sites, mutual aid drives, all kinds of things. And you can build constellations in that galaxy and hear these sounds sort of moving together. And so we built this to sort of say that this kind of care is extraordinary, but it is not new. Black people have been taking care of themselves in their communities in this way for a very long time. And I'll stop there. Yeah.
Thank you, Allie. We just want to, would you move back one slide? Just want to say that of all the things going on today, we have something to celebrate, and that is the publication of Allie's new book, because March 11th is the day that this book comes out, today. So again, Allie, congratulations on your book.
Thank you.
Nicole, would you like to go next?
Hi, everyone. My name is Nicole Musgrave, and I'm a public folklorist based in Athens, Ohio. I've been there for the past year, and prior to that, when the pandemic started, I was living in Southeast Kentucky. As a public folklorist, I was working for a nonprofit where I was primarily working in the public schools, coordinating different traditional arts programming. And as the school shut down, I got laid off, that sort of led me into my documentation work around the pandemic. Next slide, please. And so in 2020 and 2021, I worked as a contractor on two documentation projects for an organization through Berea College in Kentucky called Partners for Education. And they are an organization that provides a lot of extra support for children age birth to seniors in high school. Lots of different kinds of wraparound care and support. And they were really interested in figuring out what were the needs of students and their families during this time, and how could they better respond to those needs and the challenges that they were facing. So that was the impetus for my work doing oral histories with these groups. The first project focused on seniors in high school and their transition to post-secondary education and what they were experiencing. And then the second project focused on early learners, so birth to third grade, talking with their parents, teachers, caregivers. And all of these interviews were conducted over the phone because this was during height of the pandemic, during lockdown. And then the second major project, or I guess the third, the bulk of the interviews took place in 2024. And this was a project for the American Folklife Center, and it focused specifically on rural child care workers within 5 states in Appalachia. And I should say that the first two focused specifically on a handful of counties in East Kentucky, so a larger geographic scope in this more recent project. And next slide, please. And so for this more recent project, I wanted to just share an audio clip from one of my interviews with Tammy Sarver and Steffi Schaefer. Steffi is a preschool teacher at Blue Mountain School in Floyd, Virginia, and Tammy is the director. And I will go to the next slide and play the audio, please.
Everybody knew what 6 feet was, right? 6 feet is,
Oh my gosh.
6 feet is 3.5 chihuahuas.
The work that Steffi did to explain what that looks like to a preschooler while still continuing to build relationship and be nurturing and not speak in the negatives and be fear-based, but really live in possibility and connection. She would have a picture, it was 3/4 of a quarter horse or something. Like she had
researched
pictures.
average sizes of animals to make posters for the children. How far we needed to stay half a tiger apart or whatever the thing was. And just so that they would have something of a visual.
Yeah, and obviously talking about social distancing, explaining that to preschoolers. And I just really love this story because not only does it show the creativity and skill that childcare workers showed in responding to some of the challenges of the pandemic. But I think, it also gives a little bit of insight into what it could have been like for very young children to try and understand some of these things. And so, yeah, I'll pause there and pass it along.
I just want to make mention also that Nicole's collection, this excerpt that she's just showed us, the larger collection, which is called It Takes a Village, Rural Central Appalachian Child Care Workers COVID-19 Experiences, was launched on the Library of Congress's website today. So that is now accessible for folks to go and listen to. Congratulations, Nicole. Camilo?
Well, I'm glad to be here. I photographed COVID in the New York City region, and I had the support of the Library of Congress, which was fantastic that I was able to do this. Now, my interest was to go to Crossroads. Crossroads, the largest crossroads in New York City, like the Four Corners in Newark, in the New York City area. In Brooklyn, there are some, where the subways converge, where buses go, and so on. And they're most of the crossroads I photographed were minority crossroads. So my feeling was that going there, you're going to see how COVID changes, how it changes the population, how it changes the intersections that I was looking at. The first slide is at Columbia University, was the day after this was announced, and the kids, mostly foreign kids from East Asia, wanted to get their graduation done. This next one. Then the first people that you start seeing dressed for COVID were the hospital workers, which was a natural thing. And here you see one that has the gloves and has the mask, but not just the regular mask, but the more N94, whatever the name was. Let's see the next one. Then the restaurants started having signs like this, and there were signs, you could see them. There were no professional signs. I mean, this was some kid there that was just making the signs. And I would be there, and I could sometimes would go in and see how they enforce the sitting. And I personally was very scared going into those places. And let's go to the next one. So here you see one, and if you can read, I don't know if you read the Spanish, but you can see a certain apprehension about the uncertainty about what's happening, uncertainty about, whether we're going to be here. So you put the thing. I like the way they placed them, with the tape and so on. Improvise, and it was. Let's see the next one. The subways. Now the subways went from, whatever number of people ride them every year to 1/10 of what it was. So the homeless had entire subway cars for themselves. You can see an example here. See the next one? And of course, this is Times Square, and there is the naked cowboy performing for me. Let's see the next one. And here you see the check cashing places were always very important, because those are the places that the immigrants go to send remittances back home. But also you can see that there is a sign that you can cash the stimulus check. And this was really early on, so it was kind of amazing. I mean, the way the government reacted to this thing was just so quick and really had an effect. Let's see the next one. Here, of course, you all know that tremendous rush of everybody to get toilet paper and Kleenexes. So you have an example. And what was very extraordinary for me is, if so many people are dying, I mean, in no time there were 100,000 people dead in New York City. how come you don't see any signs on the streets? You don't see pictures of them. You don't see. And this was an extraordinary case where a community organization, actually, in the area of Corona, Queens, which was the worst, probably the worst impacted area in the whole country, put pictures of people who had died, and the pictures, this is what they look like. So I took photographs of Xerox pictures that were placed on a construction site. Let's see the next one. Again, the cops were really interesting because the cops, you know, they're supposed to be tough. So why should they put a mask on? You know, or why should take precautions? And in this case, it was really interesting because there was somebody there, and I think it was not COVID, that it was some kind of epilepsy, I think. And the kindness with which the cops took care of him, it really struck me, you know. And this was around the time when this sort of, the feeling about the police, you know, was in many other places, you know, police brutality and so on. I was seeing the other side. I mean, the two things can coexist, of course. Let's see the next one. And again, I mean, this kind of picture, I mean, it's a nothing picture, but so many millions of people had to go and have that thing pointed at their, so I figured, you know, it has to be immortalized in some place. I'm getting a hamburger here. So let's see the next one. So, I mean, this is also amazing. It's the need that people had in the middle of COVID, the need that they had to celebrate birthdays. They had to get those numbers that said that the kid's 7 years old, to celebrate Mother's Day. And here to celebrate some kind of Mexican festivity, I think, you know, maybe there's one in May and there's one later on, and, you know, so they were out there singing with their masks on. Let's see the next one. And here is when, of course, the George Floyd thing happened, and you would see things like this, which, of course, you know, they kind of stopped me to see them. Let's see the next one. And there's people in Newark riding the subway, not just with the mask, but also the plastic sheets on top of it. Let's see the next one. And here you see how the buses were adapted. And it's kind of, you know, first of all, nobody was paying. Everybody would enter in the back. And then you know, because a lot of people were dying, actually. A lot of the bus drivers were dying. And, you know, they wouldn't drive the bus unless there were precautions. So that's the way they were organized. And you know, so the whole front of the bus was empty. See the next one? That's a taxi cab being organized, just a gypsy cab, a poor and that kind of thing is supposed to bring fresh air for the back. Let's see the next one. And here is this kind of outfits they call pulgueras in New York, you know, where all the stuff that comes out of Amazon and Walmart and stuff that people send back, they don't fix it or anything. They just send it to different outlets where they resell it. So people get bargains. So this is in the middle of some kind of surge of the pandemic, and, you know, you can see what the situation was, and that's in Manhattan. Let's see the next one. And here is signs that appear in the subways. This is sort of chronological. Now we are like in 2021, you know, sort of middle of the year. So this kind of, they are memorials celebrating subway people who died because of COVID. See the next one. And here people working. I mean, it was just incredible. All that you had to do sort of to make some money. I mean, to the a lot of the immigrants that were cut off from the benefits, they had to do things like go selling things, street selling, and also collecting bottles and so on. That became very, very popular. The next one, please. And when the testing, came around widespread, they would go into places where you had this mixed identity. In this case, there's a pastry shop and there's a tasting center, and you don't know which one it is. There's kind of ambiguity and confusion about it. Let's see the next one. And here is when the vaccine comes in. They go to the bodegas, the corner bodegas, and they pay them a little bit, and they get to put this signs on the corner. Let's see the next one. And here's where you get your free food. They had those fridges. I don't know if they had them here in Washington, D.C., but they were all over New York. They had those community fridges, and people they would replenish them in the morning, and people would get vegetables and things like that. The next one. And at the end of the series of pictures here, this was like 2022, you begin to get stuff that if you write to a certain number, you can get help for a COVID funeral. For somebody that's buried and died like a year ago or 2 years ago, if you do the papers, you can get some money. And the next one. And that doesn't need explanation. Next one. And in Newark, that was a place for the vaccination. I mean, there was all kind of improvised. So everyone did things in a different way. And the next one. And that's from Chicago. That's from Chicago, and that's the way it was organized. But after a while, the sort of interest on things like vaccination and testing drop, and not many people went. The next one. And here again was the opposition to COVID and the vaccine. And I believe this is the last one, I think. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Camilo. Now that we know a little bit about each of you and your projects, let's have some discussion. We've shared some questions ahead of time, and I'm going to be calling on you panelists to answer individually, but this is a group discussion, so please feel free to jump in when you would like to. So the first question is, can you tell us some about the particular COVID-19 experiences of the community that you've documented, whether that be about geography, race, gender, et cetera, and how have these particularities influenced your documentation work? Ali, would you like to get us going with this question?
Yeah, for sure. So our project was spread all throughout the country. So we had a lot of different geographic regions, but in terms of thinking about how Black people were experiencing this pandemic, a lot of this was going hand in hand with the Black Lives Matter protests that were going on all year, especially after the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and so on and so forth. And so folks were really trying to push up against things in multiple different directions, right? Like they're trying to get their communities vaccinated. We worked with an amazing organization called Umoja Health in Oakland. And so they were trying to get testing, they were trying to get their communities vaccinated, but you're also trying to keep folks safe. And so after the murder of Ma'Khia Bryant in Columbus, Ohio, in 2021, there's an organization called Black Feminist Future, and they released a community altar toolkit, which we documented. But that community altar toolkit also had instructions for social distancing during a vigil. And so folks were really trying to keep each other safe in all of the ways that they could at the same time, despite that being very difficult.
Thanks, Ellie. Nicole?
Yeah, so I think for the first two projects that I worked on that were at the height of the pandemic, there was a lot that I was hearing about in terms of issues that school-age children were having to deal with. So in a very rural place like East Kentucky, internet access was a huge hurdle. So all of the virtual learning, a lot of students were having trouble getting online, lots of stories about going and sitting in McDonald's parking lots to access internet. Also hearing a lot about community responses and different businesses sort of expanding the reach of their Wi-Fi. Lots of libraries really invested in mobile hotspots. So hearing about things like that. Also, this is a community, a region that was hit really hard by the opioid epidemic. So there's a lot of instances of grandparents, great-grandparents raising children. So the stress around COVID contraction in the household was a lot higher. There's also more reports of issues around navigating virtual learning and trying to help children as older caretakers. In addition, transportation in a rural area is a major hurdle at times. And so a lot of the schools and the different organizations that supported families and students were having to think about ways to get meals out to families and, using the school bus infrastructure to deliver things out to families. And then for my more recent project, specifically focusing on the occupational group of child care workers. Being a few years out, I felt that it was more of a time for reflection versus the first two, which was really trying to figure out like what is happening in this current moment. The 2024 project was more about reflecting on what had happened. And some of the specific things that came up with that was a lot of the workers that I interviewed talked about having to shoulder a lot of personal responsibility. Do I take care of other people's children and maybe put my family at risk? There's essential workers that need to go to work, and who's going to care for their kids? So there was a lot of sort of moral ambiguity, a lot of people, weighing cost to benefit when they were in person with students. Do they hug these young children when they get hurt or are upset, or do they maintain social distancing? Is it okay to enforce mask wearing on young children, or especially when babies are really learning so much with facial expression? What's the cost benefit? And so there was a lot of people just having to navigate that on their own or within their work community. Another thing that I'll share to wrap up is that a lot of the childcare workers felt that during the pandemic, they felt an increased value in the way that people perceived their work. I think this was true of a lot of essential workers that people expressed a lot of thanks and gratitude, and really recognizing the value of certain occupations, and so a lot of people felt just really heartened by finally getting some recognition. And a lot of the refrain I heard a lot is, this isn't just babysitting. People think this is just babysitting, but there's so much that goes into it. And then, feeling some people expressing that that's sort of waned since the height of the pandemic has shifted. And a few of the folks that I talked with have transitioned into advocacy work as a result of some of the things they experienced, just realizing the way in which government support was so helpful for families and for workers. And so some of the folks I interviewed talked about transitioning into that role.
Thanks so much, Nicole. That's fascinating. Camilo, would you like to talk about some of the COVID-19 experiences of the community that you documented and maybe how that affected your documentation work?
Well,
grab your microphone, if you will, Camilo. No problem.
Sorry. A lot of my work is I work alone. I work as an individual. I immerse myself in areas where I don't know anybody, or, sometimes if I go to the same place 50, 60, or 100 times, I get to meet the street vendors or the people who do whatever they do on the corner. They hang around. So it's a view that it's much more objective. I'm not out there asking people, look, do you want to be in my picture? How can I do that if there are 100 people crossing, crossing on in a crossroads? And but the advantage that had is that it cued me to things that were going on in front of me. I mean, first of all, there was a period that the schools were closed. So you would go to the crossroads, and the students were not there. Usually, students go to the crossroads because they need a place to hang out. If they are wearing some new clothes, if they have a new hairdo, that's where they want to show it. So for the beginning, when education was online, then that they weren't there. Also, another thing that I noticed, of course, is that when I went to the schools and I would just look at the schools, and you could see the way the schools were communicating with the population. The way that the extreme variety of signs there, Group A, Group B, Group C, and the hours, and the rules and I mean, I couldn't see how people could handle this. How could they, how could these things function? So I was gathering sort of a different type of information, and sort of by doing it, not just one school, but doing 10 or 15 or 20 schools and doing their front entrance, I could get all of those signs, and you can actually see them and see, this is what they're doing. So it's a different approach, and which I'm sure you saw from the images that I showed.
Thanks, Camilo. And Midge, how about you?
Yeah, so I just want to acknowledge first that the work that all of us have done is trauma-based work, which is not always easy. So I appreciate the work that you all have done. As far as my project, again, my project was specific to the Muskogee Creek Nation and Muskogee communities. It was important to my project that that I had a wide range of individuals, of narrators that I interviewed. And so, of course, elders were important, youth. Nicole, I appreciate your work. Our kids experienced COVID-19 just as harshly as we as adults did, and I feel like maybe their stories have been left out. And so I interviewed a few Muskogee youth and healthcare workers at the Muskogee Creek Nation. We have our own healthcare system, and that was important. And then also, I had the opportunity to interview the folks who at that time, well, still are, at the top of our tribal administration. And so our chief of the Muskogee Creek Nation, second chief, I knew their insights would be really interesting and important for other Muskogee people to hear, and as well as our Secretary of Health. And so, yeah, the wide range of narrators was important, but as I've already alluded to in my introduction, COVID-19 was devastating. It was no different at the Muskogee Creek Nation on our reservation lands. We lost hundreds and hundreds of people, predominantly elders. We lost 300 citizens in the first 5 months of the pandemic, and then, of course, it just continued on for the first 3 years of the pandemic. And a lot of these people that we lost, the devastation, there is devastation in the number of people that you lose. You don't want to lose anybody, but a lot of these people that we lost were elders, and these are our knowledge keepers. These are our knowledge keepers and our language keepers. These were our folks at ceremonial grounds. The Muskogee Creek Nation still maintains multiple ceremonial grounds. We were losing our Mikos, our chiefs of those grounds, our medicine people, people who have been raised and who have spent their entire lives at ceremonial ground and ensuring that our Muskogee culture and traditions continue as our ancestors did them. And so that's the devastation that we felt at the Muskogee Creek Nation. There was also a lot of good things that were done by the Muskogee and by our tribal leadership. They were working before the pandemic even came onto the reservation, which was at the 1st of March in 2020. They were already preparing our healthcare system. They created what they called a war room, and these people were meeting every day and trying to figure out how to keep Muskogee people safe and how to keep them alive. And so there's a lot of gratitude for that. But this project itself was a necessary project for multiple reasons. But it was an opportunity for us to, through the Muskogee Voice, it's an opportunity for us through the Muskogee Voice to share our story, which is really important since predominantly our history has been written by non-Indigenous, non-Muskogee people. Again, to address or to counter the erasure of our pandemic experiences. It was also an important opportunity for us to add critical knowledge and information to our historical record. We know that our ancestors before us experienced, suffered, endured, survived previous pandemics, but we don't have good written record of that. And now we do, and we have oral record of how our people suffered, but also how they survived. And so also this project was important because as we're doing all these things and gathering this knowledge, as Indigenous peoples, we're always, always, always thinking about our future generations. And so now we have these things for our future generations if they were to ever experience such a thing as what their 21st century ancestors experienced with the COVID-19 pandemic. Yeah. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Midge. Thank you so much. I want to move on to another question about medium. So what's kind of interesting about the folks on the stage is that we have two oral historians, we have a photographer, and we have someone specializing in sound who's an ethnomusicologist. So I'm really interested, panelists, about medium. And given the specific medium that you used, how did that medium influence your documentation and your archival work related to the pandemic? And Nicole and Midge, you both are working in oral history. So do you want to start off with responding to this question about medium?
Yeah. So as an Indigenous oral historian, in response to this question, the first thing that popped into my head was the cultural practice of oral tradition. So oral tradition and the practice of that, Indigenous peoples have been doing that since time immemorial. It's just a part of Indigenous lifeways. And it continues to be a critical piece of Indigenous lifeways and how we gather and keep and share history across generations of Indigenous peoples. And so we've always practiced that. And now we have this thing, and Nicole and I had a big conversation about this earlier. We have this thing called oral history methodology, which began in this country in the early 20th century. The process of gathering knowledge and information through audio or video recordings for preservation purposes. One of the key things about oral history methodology is that it was intended to focus on those peoples who historically are being marginalized and dismissed from the historical narrative of this country. And so I feel like as an Indigenous oral historian, oral history methodology gives me the means of gathering, protecting, preserving the knowledge and teachings, the oral traditions of Muskogee people, and contributing to the longevity of our culture and our ways of living and memory of Muskogee lived experiences. And so I feel like for anyone who's never listened to an oral history interview, it is an opportunity to learn about history from a primary source, to hear it from a voice of the lived experience. It can be a very profound learning experience. I encourage people to engage with oral history and these interviews. I think they allow an emotional connection, which is important, because I feel like through that emotional connection, people can have a deeper understanding. And as people, we need to have those deeper understandings of our history. One of the things, there's lots of things that I love about the work, about oral history methodology, but one of the things that I wanted to mention here today, as it does pertain very much so to the COVID-19 pandemic, is healing and the absolute power that oral history has to initiate healing, whether that's for an individual or a community of people. With my work and with this pandemic project, I have seen that firsthand. Just sitting down with someone and giving them that opportunity to share their life story, to share their experiences. I have experienced through this project lightheartedness and laughter with people. I have experienced grief and tears with people, but I have seen the process open the door to allow people to start their healing process. I'll stop there.
Thanks so much, Midge. Nicole, do you want to continue on talking about oral history in your work?
Yeah. I guess just to echo what Midge ended on, just the healing power of oral history. That was something that was articulated in particular in that first batch of interviews I did in the 2020-2021 projects. People were just so, in the height of their anxiety, their stress, their grief and fear, and so many articulated that it felt very therapeutic to be able to talk to somebody and kind of vent to somebody about what was going on. I guess, I see my job as an oral historian as, facilitating somebody's, narration of their experiences. And so often people say, well, what can I do to prepare? And I tell them, well, if I do my job right, you don't really have to prepare anything. Like, I'll help jog your memories and help you, narrate what you went through and what you experienced. And, in addition to trying to capture some of the cold, hard facts, it's really important to me to also ask people about how they felt about things and have them reflect on that deeper level. And so that was certainly a priority with the work I've done documenting COVID. And I guess in terms of how oral history has influenced my approach to the work, I think for me, I really look at it as, again, having the first group of projects being in the height of the pandemic, the second project being in, a later stage of it. I think my approach differed with those things in mind. So in that first set of projects, really looking to just assess the current situation and get people's read on what was going on, what did they need, what was working out for them that that they would want to share with other people in the community. Whereas the second project, I was really trying to capture this more reflective state, and so structuring the interviews in a way where people shared how they got into childcare work, what life was like before the pandemic, and then kind of getting into, okay, then what happened once the pandemic really did hit. I think that's what I've got to say about that.
Thank you, Nicole. Allie, how about you in working in the medium of sound?
Yeah, working with sound is great for many reasons. I think It allows me to push at genre and push at form a bit, especially being in the academy where so many things are really text-based. Asking the question, well, what does this sound like, or what can this sound like, can really push us forward in a way. In this particular project, sound gave us access to a kind of affect that we were looking for. And I have sounds from the project. Andrew, yeah. So before I play this little demo video from the site, just to shout out my collaborators for this project because I do nothing alone. This project was made possible by a lot of people, but the sounds that you're going to hear were made by a band called Boom Scat. They are a local band from DC. They are made up of two folks, Asha Santee, who's actually on the cover of my book. She designed my book cover. She's one of my favorite collaborators. So if you ever see anything visual, Asha probably made it. And so Asha's the producer, drummer, instrumentalist for Boom Scat. And then the voice you'll hear is Patience. And Patience is one of my favorite singers ever. And so when I was originally thinking about doing this project, I was really enamored with the sound of the Hammond B3 organ because I was thinking a lot about gospel music and Black life. And I'm like, yes, I'm going to attach all of the stars to a note on an organ, and then when you play your constellation, it'll just play a chord. But then I did a residency with Boom Scat at Brandeis a few years ago, and listening to Patience sing every day was pretty much like, no, this is exactly what I'm looking for, because we were trying to sonify vastness. Like, what does care sound like? What does the kind of unquantifiable vastness of Black care sound like? How can I get there? And her voice became the method to do that. And so I asked Patience, I was like, can I build constellations with your voice? And the thing with me is that I'm always asking people these really far out questions, but people roll with me and I'm very grateful. And so she said yes. And then Asha and I sat down and said, okay, we're gonna categorize these stories this way. Each category of story is gonna have this sound. And then, so we're just, we have pictures of like all of this work on the whiteboard that we did to like do all this math and get all these chords together. And Patience went in that booth and sang for 10 minutes, and that was it. Like, when you got it, you got it. And so every sound in that project was made from her doing one 10-minute take and being like, y'all good? Like, y'all have, and we were like, yeah, we're good. And so then Asha spliced them all up, and it was amazing. So we can play this video now. Oh, is it gonna play? Oh, there's no audio on it. We would need that. So that's just one example of a 2-star constellation. If you go on the site, you can build 2- and 3-star constellations. So if you pick any 3 stars, you can reset them, and they will pull you a different story for each constellation and stack those 3 sounds. And Patience's voice is really out of this world. So if you ever get a chance to go to a Boom Scat show, you should. Yeah.
Thank you, Ali. I think you've given us a great example about how sound can go across genres. You've given us an example, a wonderful example of that. Camilo, I pigeonholed you. You are taking photographs, but you're also taking notes when you're taking photographs, right? Yeah. Tell us a little about that in terms of medium for your COVID-19 work.
Well, I use photographs as a way of discovery to find out what's out there. So, after I take a photograph, I examine it, I look at it, I look at similar photographs, and then I try to formulate questions. So if I approach somebody, I want to have specific questions to ask them. And sometimes it's very useful, but sometimes it's not. Like, for instance, particularly folk artists that, like a folk artist that that has the Bible and has a Bible orientation, and all he wants to talk is about religion rather than what he's doing. So, so if you have a specific question that you want to ask, in other words, why do you paint those shopping carts yellow? And then not to talk about, what God's plan for us is. It's very difficult to sort of keep them to the issues that, why are you stacking those discarded tires, and making them, arranging them rather than having them all over the place here in this lot where you're making your statement. So that's one of the things that is, it's, I try to build. It's not that sometimes I may not get very far, but it's the image, the fact that this is a material thing, that it exists there in a certain form, that I have an image of that same thing that I took a year ago, and I'll have another one that I will take the next year, just gives me a base with which to work. And I think it particularly what I like to break through sometimes is that people, particularly people that are very articulate, they develop a view of things, so that a view of things is kind of, it may not have to do much with reality itself, but it has to do with the way the presentation of the self is not, and that's one of my issues of all those cassettes that they have in Grand Central Station, where you go and tell your life story, is your life story after you've told the life story 100 times, and it's the 101th time, and it's manufactured. So how do you get to real things? And it's very difficult, and that's what I'm striving with, and I don't know to what degree I'm being successful.
Thank you, Camilo. We have some time for question and answer. If you have a question, please raise your hand. My colleagues will bring around a microphone, and please speak into the microphone so we can have your question on the recording. But yes, please go ahead.
I'm Kevin from Buffalo. There's a woman, Natalie Merchant, is a member of your board. Proud of Natalie. And Rick James is from Buffalo. Not so proud of Kathy Hochul, but the percentage of Native Americans who died seemed really high. Is that because young people left the reservation, or because they didn't have ventilators? And I was just kind of shocked by 3.5 times more people died.
It's because of a lot of things. We could have a whole nother presentation just on that. But I mean, I mentioned long-standing challenges of colonialism. And I said it that way because I knew I only had 3 minutes for my introduction.
Sorry.
And knowing that I didn't have time to go into any detail about that. But I'll just say this. When you consider the fact that in this country, we still have indigenous peoples living on reservations without indoor plumbing, proper access to water, improper access to water, to clean water, and no means of internet, therefore no real education about what was happening with COVID-19, what was happening outside of the reservation. These are the things that continue to perpetuate indigenous people's issues, their healthcare issues. Indigenous peoples experience healthcare issues again, at a much higher rate in this country than non-Indigenous peoples do. So in a nutshell, they were, before the pandemic even happened, they were already behind the 8 ball with a lot of things in their lives. And so, as I said, COVID-19 just exacerbated all of those things and made it much, much, much more difficult for them to deal with the pandemic.
Hi, thank you all for your talk. I'm Amanda Lehman. I work at the library here, and I work in web archives. And one of our big challenges has been what we can include, what we can capture faithfully, and then also what we don't include, what's just not within our collection. So I wonder if any of you in the process of your collections have had to leave anything off the record, or if you could tell any people or events that maybe you chose not to record.
I can speak to that. There were a lot of stories that we gathered that did not end up in the project. Because this project started at Dartmouth, which has a particular sort of, it's a particular kind of institution. I wanted to be very wary and very thoughtful and very intentional about how I approach a lot of these organizations, because the work that they are doing is to help keep Black people safe. Some of that work cannot be public or publicized in this way. And so each individual star in Black COVID Care, we reached out to them. We got their okay for them to be in the website. And there were some people who were doing and are still doing amazing work that I just couldn't put on there. And that's completely fine. And I think this process was really helpful because I got to have so many cool conversations with folks. Like, there are some grandmothers in Portland, Oregon that have this program called Grandma's Hands, and they teach younger generations how to make traditional meals. And when I was telling them what I was doing, they were like, what? And so we had a Zoom, and now I'm like friends with these grandmas, and I got to go see them last year in Oregon, and we had this big dinner, and it was like so fun. And so just building these relationships, because I'm coming from a place where it's like, Dartmouth is not the most hospitable, not the most approachable institution, for good reason. And so I really wanted to come in and be like, you're not going to be on this site unless you want to be on this site. And that's, so there's a lot that got left out.
Other folks want to respond to that?
I'll respond. So with my project, I interviewed 40 narrators, and, they're all given the proper paperwork, and they're all given the opportunity to put any restrictions on their interview, and all that's explained to them. I'm very adamant about that and protecting our people's intellectual property and who's going to hear these things. I did not have a single person put in a restriction on their interview. Even so, if there had been something in any of these interviews, I probably would have had a conversation with that individual and said, okay, let's talk about this. But, that is the thing with Indigenous peoples and sharing our knowledge, our cultural knowledge. So much of that has been improperly taken, misappropriated, and so we're very careful about that. And if there had been anything in any of these interviews, we would have approached that appropriately, but that was not the case with this project.
We've got time for one more question. Anyone have anything they'd like to ask? Yes, Alina, please. Yeah. Mike's coming your way.
Thank you for this wonderful conversation and these amazing projects. I was really touched and excited to hear the conversation about healing. I do recognize this is trauma work, and we discuss in the archive at the American Folklife Center the effect of trauma-based materials, not only on the people who see them and will benefit from these collections, but the people who process them and work with them every day here. And so do you have any musings or reflections? I know that we discussed, or you discussed, affect and capturing the emotional intensity through sound and through oral history, and the grief and healing of having these interviews and seeing people on the ground in the moment that they exist in this extremely terrible time. Like, so musings on the impact on you as professionals. How did your, I don't want to, ask too deep of a question, but how did that impact your actual documentation efforts? Did you have to change because you're going through COVID at the same time that you're documenting it, and that you're, sorry, that's a really long question, but I think you know what I'm trying to get at. You're experiencing this as a human being, and you're also now uncovering so many myriad stories. So how did that impact your actual documentation efforts?
I'll chime in and say that with the early work I did in 2020, 2021, as I already shared, the folks I was interviewing were in very heightened states of stress, anxiety, fear, and yeah, I was myself. And I just remember many times getting off the phone, because they were phone interviews, and just like crying, because it was just felt so hopeless, like what people were dealing with, and people were expressing hopelessness in a lot of different ways, and just hearing about the impacts that it was, having on young kids, it just seemed so insurmountable and just so intense. And yeah, that was I've heard a lot from colleagues and who do oral history work, and the impact that it has on them and the need to take care. And I don't know, that was the first time I really experienced that in a very visceral way. And I guess for me, I just was grateful to have people I could kind of process some of that with, and lived in a rural place where I could go on a lot of hikes and kind of digest and clear my head. But yeah, it was a very intense process for me.
Thank you.
Camila,
Oh, I'm sorry.
make sure to hold it here.
No, what I was going to say is that I encounter an extraordinary situation, which is people who had COVID, and COVID was, they were experiencing coughing and, to a terrible extent that they had to double up or they were unable to stand, felt the shame of having COVID. And if this happened to them in public, the last thing they wanted was to be approached and, of course, it'd be, kind of extremely insensitive to start asking questions, but also taking pictures is extremely, so it's almost like for the person to have the picture taken while they had COVID, or what COVID is manifesting itself and intensely, it was worse than having COVID. So there are some barriers there that I experienced in several cases, and I mean they are vivid because they stick in your head. This kind of stuff you don't forget. So intense. Somebody trying, just goes to get some food, some free food, has his boxes, but at the same time, he's so weak and coughing, and he's holding up to a pole because otherwise the food's going to fall, and the subways keep passing by, but cannot walk into the subway because he's going to fall, and and that's the collapse of things. So there were barriers to what you could capture and what you could have.
On that note, I want to say that is the time that we have for today's discussion. This has been an important discussion, difficult to revisit all of these things, but we hope that this will inspire more discussion at this 5-year anniversary of the COVID-19 pandemic about how we remember and what we forget at the same time. This is the first project for the COVID-19 American History Project, but this is not the last program that we're going to do. In March of 2026, we're also going to have a 2-day symposium here at the Library of Congress to talk more about thinking about COVID-19 and national national memory and individual history and things like that. So please keep your attention to the Facebook page of the American Folklife Center for more information on that. I also want to thank the Prints and Photographs Division for being a co-sponsor of today's event. Thank you, Adam. We really appreciate you helping to spread the word. Also, thanks to Dr. Andrea Decker, Thea Austin, Dr. John Finn, Dr. Steve Winnick, and Dr. Nancy Gross, and the rest of the American Folklife Center for your help with today's program. We also want to thank the library's multimedia group and Jamal Gordon. We literally could not do this without you guys. Thank you so much. And then finally, panelists, I want to thank you for being a part of today's discussion. Because of the work that you've done, we now have a greater understanding of what the heck happened during this 5 years. So thank you for all that work. And then finally, thank you all in the audience for coming. We really appreciate you being with us here today. And with that, we'll say have a great afternoon. Thank you.